Millionaire invites Black Maid's son to play chess as a joke, biggest mistake of his life. That was the headline people would be whispering about months later, but the story... Oh, the story began one quiet Sunday afternoon in the heart of New York City. In a glass-walled penthouse overlooking Central Park, Thomas Whitaker, one of Manhattan's wealthiest venture capitalists, was hosting one of his famous cocktail luncheons. These gatherings were less about friendship and more about flaunting status. Crystal champagne flutes, caviar laid out on polished silver trays, waiters gliding through in crisp white jackets. And at the center of it all was Whitaker himself, tall, broad-shouldered, with that kind of smug confidence only money could buy. Thomas Whitaker wasn't just rich, he was obscenely rich. He had made his fortune buying up tech startups and flipping them like poker chips. But what he really loved wasn't business, it was winning. Winning at anything. Cards, golf, squash, and most of all, chess. Whitaker wasn't a grandmaster, of course, but in his social circle, he liked to think he was one. He kept an antique mahogany chess set in his living room, each piece carved by hand in Italy. For Whitaker, chess wasn't just a game. It was a way of reminding people how clever, how superior, how utterly unbeatable he was. And on that Sunday afternoon, after downing his second glass of vintage champagne, he had the bright idea to turn the game into entertainment for his guests. "Who's brave enough to challenge me today?" Whitaker asked, his voice booming across the room. Laughter rippled through the crowd. Most of them had seen him play before. They knew how seriously he took it, how he hated to lose, and how vicious he could be when he won. A couple of businessmen chuckled nervously and shook their heads. No one dared step forward. And then, almost by accident, Whitaker's eyes fell on someone standing near the corner of the room. It was Gloria, his longtime maid. She was in her mid-40s, an African-American woman with tired eyes and a quiet dignity. She had been working for the Whitakers for nearly a decade, scrubbing their floors, polishing their silver, making sure every cocktail napkin was folded at a perfect right angle. And that day, by her side, was her son. The boy was maybe 14, thin, wiry, wearing an oversized second-hand polo shirt and scuffed sneakers. His name was Jamal. He didn't belong to the glittering world of wealth and privilege around him. He was just there because Gloria couldn't find a sitter. Whitaker smirked. An idea struck him. "Hey, Gloria," he called out loudly, making sure all his guests heard. "How about your boy there? Does he play chess?" The room went silent. For a moment, Gloria stiffened, not sure how to respond. Jamal looked down at his shoes. "Oh, come on," Whitaker said, his grin widening. "It'll be fun. A little Sunday amusement. What do you say, kid?" A few of the guests chuckled. They thought it was harmless. A joke. After all, what chance did some teenager from Harlem have against a millionaire who prided himself on being unbeatable? Jamal lifted his head slowly. His eyes met Whitaker's, and for the first time there was no trace of shyness. His voice was calm, almost steady. "Yes, sir," he said quietly. "I play." Whitaker clapped his hands together. "Excellent! Ladies and gentlemen, the match is on!" They cleared a space in the living room. The antique chessboard was set up on a glass coffee table, the ivory and ebony pieces gleaming under the chandelier. Guests circled around, sipping. Champagne ready to watch what they assumed would be a quick and humiliating defeat for the maid's son. Whitaker gestured to the board. "White or black?" he asked smugly. "Black," Jamal said without hesitation. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. Most kids wanted white. They wanted the first move, the advantage. But Jamal? He just sat down, calm as a still lake. The game began. Whitaker made his first move confidently, pawn to e4. It was his favorite opening, aggressive, dominant. Jamal responded with pawn to c5. Whitaker blinked. The Sicilian defense, not a casual move, not the kind of opening you expected from a 14-year-old. Kid in hand-me-down clothes. A couple of guests exchanged curious glances. Whitaker brushed it off. He leaned forward, moving his knight. Minutes passed. Pieces clicked softly against the board. At first, the guests laughed and chatted, but slowly, the laughter faded. One by one, they fell silent, watching closely. Because it was becoming obvious, Jamal wasn't just playing, he was calculating. Every move was sharp, precise, deliberate. Whitaker frowned. His strategy wasn't working. Every time he tried to corner the kid, Jamal slipped away, countered, set a trap. The smug grin on the millionaire's face began to falter. By the 20th move, Whitaker was sweating. By the 30th, his hands trembled slightly when he reached for his queen. And by the 40th, the unthinkable happened. "Checkmate," Jamal said softly. The room froze. Whitaker stared at the board, his mouth slightly open. His king was trapped. There was no escape. The maid's son had beaten him. The silence was broken by a sharp burst of laughter from one of the guests, then another and another. Soon the room was filled with nervous chuckles, clinking glasses, murmurs of disbelief. Whitaker's face turned red. He forced a smile, but his jaw was clenched so tightly you could almost hear his teeth grinding. "Well," he said stiffly, pushing back his chair, "beginner's luck." But inside, inside he was burning. No one made a fool of Thomas Whitaker in his own penthouse. And yet, what he didn't know was that this game, this little joke, was only the beginning. What started as a rich man's amusement was about to unravel into something much bigger, something that would shake his entire world and prove that sometimes the people you underestimate the most are the ones destined to change everything. Because Jamal wasn't just some kid who happened to be good at chess. He was something else entirely, and that was the biggest mistake of Whitaker's life. The room was still buzzing long after Jamal placed Whitaker's king into its final, humiliating corner. Guests whispered, exchanged glances, tried to suppress grins. To them, it was entertainment. To Whitaker, it was war. As the last chuckles faded, Whitaker rose from his seat, straightened his expensive suit, and forced a laugh. "Well played, kid. Very well played." His voice was sharp, but his smile was thinner than paper. Jamal nodded, not cocky, not gloating, just calm, almost respectful. "Thank you, sir." Gloria stood in the corner, hands clasped tightly in front of her apron. Pride swelled in her chest, though she didn't dare show it too boldly. She had raised Jamal with the little she had, in a cramped apartment with peeling paint and rent that ate up nearly everything she earned. But here he was, standing toe-to-toe with a man like Whitaker and holding his ground. The guests began drifting back to their champagne and chatter, but Whitaker wasn't done. Oh no, he couldn't let this stand. "Why don't we make it interesting?" he said suddenly, his voice louder now, drawing everyone's attention back to him. "One more game. Double or nothing." Jamal tilted his head. "Double or nothing," Whitaker smirked. "You win again, I'll give you $500. But if I win," he paused, savoring the moment, "you'll come back next Sunday. And the Sunday after that. Until I say we're even," the guests murmured. Some of them frowned. It felt unfair, predatory even. But Whitaker was a master manipulator. He framed it as if he were giving the boy a golden opportunity. $500 for a maid's son? That was a fortune. Gloria's heart clenched. She opened her mouth to protest, but Jamal spoke first. His voice was steady. "Deal." Gloria turned to him sharply. "Jamal," but it was too late. He had already extended his hand across the board. Whitaker shook it firmly, his grin returning. The second game began. This time, Whitaker played slower, his brow furrowed in concentration. He tried new openings, switched strategies, even attempted traps he had memorized from online Grandmaster games. But Jamal flowed around them like water slipping past rocks. Every time Whitaker thought he had him, the boy turned the tables. By the 32nd move, Whitaker realized he was in trouble again. By the 45th, "Checkmate," Jamal whispered. The guests gasped. Some even clapped. A couple exchanged looks of outright awe. Whitaker's smile cracked. He shoved his chair back so hard it scraped across the marble floor. His face was crimson now, but he couldn't explode. Not here, not in front of them. "Impressive," he muttered through clenched teeth. He reached into his wallet and pulled out 5 crisp $100 bills. He slapped them on the table in front of Jamal. "There, you earned it." Jamal picked up the money carefully, like it was a fragile treasure. He nodded again. "Thank you." Whitaker forced a laugh and waved to his butler. "Drinks for everyone, let's celebrate." But inside, he was seething. humiliated twice in one night, in his own home, by a boy half his age. He couldn't stop replaying the look on Jamal's face, not smug, not mocking, but calm, composed. Like he had been in control all along. Whitaker wasn't the type to forgive. Later that night, when the guests were gone and the penthouse was quiet, he poured himself a glass of scotch and stood by the window, staring out over the glittering lights of Manhattan. His jaw tightened. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next week, Jamal returned. Gloria had begged him not to go back, but Jamal was stubborn. Something about the challenge lit a fire inside him. He didn't just want to play chess, he needed to. It was the one place where the world made sense. Where it didn't matter how rich you were, or the color of your skin, or whether your shoes had holes in them. On the chessboard, there were only rules, logic, strategy, and Jamal was a master. Week after week, Whitaker invited him back. Each time, he offered more money. $1,000, $2,000. Each time, Jamal won. And each time, Whitaker grew, more obsessed. He studied books, hired private tutors, even flew in a retired grandmaster to give him lessons. But no matter what he tried, no matter how many openings he memorized, no matter how carefully he planned, Jamal always found a way to dismantle him. The guests who once laughed now whispered behind his back. They weren't laughing at Jamal, they were laughing at him, the mighty Thomas Whitaker, outsmarted again and again by a Maid'S son. And that humiliation twisted something dark inside him. Whitaker began to see Jamal not as a boy, not as a prodigy, but as a threat. One rainy evening, after yet another crushing defeat, Whitaker finally snapped. "You think you're smarter than me, don't you?" he hissed across the board, his eyes burning. Jamal looked at him steadily. "It's just a game, sir." Whitaker slammed his fist on the table. The pieces rattled violently. "It's not just a game!" Gloria, who had been waiting quietly in the corner, flinched. Whitaker leaned closer, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. "You may have talent, kid, but don't forget where you came from. Don't forget who you are." Jamal's expression didn't change, but inside something hardened. He had dealt with arrogance before, with condescension, with people who looked down on him, but this was different. This was war, and he wasn't going to back down. Because what Whitaker didn't realize, what no one in that penthouse realized, was that Jamal wasn't just playing for himself anymore. He was playing for every kid who had ever been underestimated. Every kid who had been told they didn't belong. Every kid who had been laughed at for daring to dream. And that battle was only just beginning. The storm that had begun in Thomas Whitaker's penthouse didn't stay contained within those polished walls. Word had a way of slipping out, especially in Manhattan's elite circles. And by the third week of Jamal's repeated victories, the whispers had grown louder than champagne bubbles in a flute. "Did you hear? Some kid beat Whitaker at chess. Not once, not twice, 5 times. They say he's a Maid'S son." No. Really? The story was too delicious not to spread. It wasn't just gossip. It was humiliation, a chink in the armor of one of the city's most untouchable men. And while Whitaker fumed in silence, Jamal was beginning to taste something he'd never known before: recognition. At school, things started to change. Jamal had always kept to himself, the quiet kid in the back who teachers thought was bright but distracted. Most of his classmates barely noticed him, but now rumors were buzzing through the hallways. "Yo, that's him! The chess kid. He beat some rich guy in the city. They're saying he's a genius." For the first time, people were looking at Jamal not as the kid with hand-me-down shoes, but as something else, something bigger. But fame, even in whispers, came with a price. One afternoon, as Jamal was leaving school, a man in a dark suit was waiting by the gate. He had slicked back hair, sharp cheekbones, and the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "You must be Jamal," he said smoothly. "Name's Victor Kane, talent scout." Jamal blinked. "For what?" "Chess," Kane said, as if the answer should have been obvious. "There's a tournament downtown this weekend. City level, big names, big prizes. I've got a spot open for you." Jamal hesitated. He'd never competed in a real tournament before. Chess had always been something he played in parks, online, in the quiet corners of libraries, not under bright lights with people watching. But something inside him, maybe the same fire that refused to bow to Whitaker, made him nod. "I'll do it." Gloria wasn't thrilled. Baby, you don't owe these people nothing, she said, shaking her head as she folded laundry that night. Don't let them use you. Don't let them turn you into a show. Jamal sat quietly, thinking, Mom, it's not about them. It's about me. I want to see how far I can go. Gloria looked at him, her eyes softening. She saw the determination in his face, the same look his father used to have before life wore him down. She sighed. All right, but promise me one thing. You don't let them change who you are. Jamal nodded. The tournament was held in a downtown hotel ballroom, chandeliers glittering above rows of long tables. The smell of polished wood and nervous sweat filled the air. Jamal stepped inside and froze. This was a different world. Kids in blazers, adults with briefcases, clocks ticking sharply beside boards, reporters scribbling notes. And in the back, leaning casually against a column, was Thomas Whitaker. Jamal's stomach tightened. Whitaker caught his eye and smiled coldly, lifting his glass in mock salute. It wasn't coincidence. Whitaker had pulled strings, made calls, arranged for Jamal to be invited. He wanted the boy under pressure on a bigger stage with real consequences. You won't beat them all, Whitaker whispered to a friend nearby, his grin venomous. Let's see how he handles the real world. The first round began. Jamal sat down across from a boy his age, dressed in a crisp navy blazer, hair slicked back with gel. The boy smirked, clearly underestimating him. Good luck, the boy said. Jamal just nodded. The game began, and within 20 minutes the boy's smirk had melted into panic. Jamal dismantled him piece by piece until the final blow. Checkmate, whispers, rippled across the room. Round 2, round 3, round 4. Each time, Jamal won. Some opponents lasted longer, some tried tricky openings, but none of them could break through the wall of his calm precision. By the semifinals, reporters had gathered around his table, snapping photos, scribbling notes. A story was forming. The underdog, the prodigy, the Maid'S son from Harlem taking down the city's elite. And in the corner of the ballroom, Whitaker watched, his smile fading more with every victory. The final match came. Jamal's opponent was a man in his 30s, tall, sharp-eyed, with an aura of experience. He wasn't a kid from prep school. He was a seasoned competitor, a ranked player, someone who had been to nationals. Don't get nervous, kid, the man said with a smirk as they shook hands. This isn't a playground. Jamal said nothing. He sat, breathed, focused. The game was brutal. Back and forth, attack and defense, pawns sacrificed like soldiers in a war. For the first time, Jamal felt sweat on his palms. The man was good, very good. But Jamal was better. He remembered every lesson he had taught himself late at night, every puzzle solved in dusty library books, every move played in the park against old men who lived for the game. He saw patterns where others saw chaos. He saw openings where others saw walls. And finally, after an hour that felt like a lifetime, he pushed his rook forward. Checkmate. The room erupted. Cameras flashed. People clapped. Some even stood. Reporters rushed forward. The champion, was a Maid'S son from Harlem. Whitaker's glass shattered in his hand. That night, headlines began to appear online. Harlem teen shocks, NYC chess scene. Underdog prodigy wins city tournament. Son of housekeeper defeats Manhattan's elite. Jamal's name was everywhere. Interviews, photos, invitations. Colleges wanted to talk. Sponsors reached out. Chess clubs across the country were buzzing. But not everyone was celebrating. Thomas Whitaker sat alone in his penthouse, staring at his chessboard. The pieces mocked him. No matter how many times he replayed the games in his mind, no matter how many books he studied, the truth was undeniable. Jamal was better. And for a man like Whitaker, who thrived on control, on power, on winning, that was unacceptable. So he made a decision. If he couldn't beat Jamal on the board, he'd beat him off it. Thomas Whitaker had built his empire on one simple principle: if you can't win fairly, win by any other means necessary. And now, staring at the headlines plastered across his iPad, he decided to treat Jamal not as a boy, but as an opponent. An enemy. The first move was subtle. A week after Jamal's city tournament victory, Gloria came home to find an envelope slipped under their apartment door. Inside was a notice. Her rent had tripled. No warning, no explanation. The landlord shrugged when she confronted him. Market rates gone up, nothing personal, but it was personal. Whitaker owned half the block. Gloria's hands shook as she folded the paper. She thought about telling Jamal, but he was already carrying so much. Instead, she quietly began working double shifts, her body aching just to keep a roof over their heads. But Whitaker wasn't done. At Jamal's school, a counselor pulled him aside. "Jamal," she said gently, "we've received concerns about your attendance." "My attendance?" Jamal frowned. "I've been here every day." "Yes, but there are reports. Lateness, missing homework, even cheating." Jamal's eyes widened. "That's not true." But the reports kept coming. Anonymous tips, forged notes, fabricated evidence. Suddenly, the boy who had been invisible his whole life was under a microscope. Teachers eyed him with suspicion. Classmates whispered again, not in admiration this time, but doubt, and through it all Whitaker waited, watching. Because he knew something about Jamal. No matter how good he was on the board, he was just a kid. Pressure could break him, but Jamal didn't break. If anything, the attacks only sharpened him. He started spending late nights at the Harlem Chess Club, a cramped but lively room above a barber shop, where old men argued over strategy and kids hustled games for pocket change. There Jamal found his people, men who had nothing but their wits, kids who fought for respect move by move. "You got something special, boy," one of the elders told him, slapping the board after Jamal dismantled his defense. "Don't you let no rich man take that from you." The words stuck. So when an invitation came for the National Junior Chess Championship, Jamal didn't hesitate. It was the biggest stage yet, and of course, Whitaker made sure he was there. The championship was held in Chicago, a cavernous convention center filled with hundreds of boards, cameras, and commentators broadcasting live. For Jamal, stepping inside felt like stepping into another universe. But for Whitaker, it was a hunting ground. He wasn't there to play. He was there to pull strings. He whispered to officials, slipped envelopes into hands, spread rumors through the press. The boy's unstable, trouble at school, poor family background. He wanted Jamal painted not as a prodigy, but as a fluke. And yet, when the first round began, none of that mattered. Because on the board, Jamal was untouchable. He won his opening games with ease. Then the harder rounds came, kids trained by grandmasters, students from elite academies, players who had traveled halfway across the world. Each time, Jamal dug deeper. He saw through traps, dismantled gambits, turned defenses into attacks. Commentators started buzzing. "Who is this? Kid? He's playing like a seasoned master. This isn't just talent, it's genius." By the semifinals, Jamal had become the tournament's heartbeat. Crowds gathered around his table, cameras lingered on his every move, and in the shadows, Whitaker clenched his jaw. Nothing he tried could derail the boy, so he decided on one final move, something drastic. The night before the final, Gloria was woken by a knock on her hotel door. When she opened it, Thomas Whitaker was standing there, flanked by two men in suits. "Gloria," he said smoothly, "we need to talk." Her heart pounded. "What are you doing here?" Whitaker smiled coldly. "It's simple. Tomorrow, your boy throws the match. He resigns early, quietly. If he does, I'll make sure you and Jamal are taken care of. A new apartment, a trust fund, comfort, for the rest of your lives. And if we don't," the smile faded, his voice dropped, "then I'll make sure you have nothing. No home, no school, no future." Gloria's hands trembled. She wanted to scream at him, to slam the door in his face, but fear kept her frozen. "Think it over," Whitaker said, slipping a business card onto the nightstand. "You've got until tomorrow." He left without another word. The next morning, Gloria sat Jamal down. "Baby," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You don't have to play. Not today. We can walk away." Jamal looked at her, confused. "What are you talking about?" Tears welled in her eyes. "Because they'll come for us if you win. They'll take everything." For the first time, Jamal saw the depth of her fear, the weight she'd carried alone for weeks, and his chest ached, not just for himself, but for her. But then he shook, his head. "Mom, if I quit now, they've already won. Whitaker's already won. I can't let that happen." Gloria gripped his hands. "Jamal," but he stood, steady and unshaken. "You told me once not to let them change who I am. This is who I am." And with that, he walked into the arena. The final match began. His opponent was the reigning junior champion, a boy from California with perfect posture, a coach whispering in his ear, and confidence radiating from every pore. The cameras zoomed in, the crowd hushed. "Good luck," the champion said with a smirk. Jamal nodded. His mind was clear, his heart was steady. The clock started. Pieces clattered softly. Pawns advanced, knights leapt, queens prowled. Move by move, the board became a battlefield. The champion was strong, stronger than anyone Jamal had faced yet. He pushed Jamal into corners, set deadly traps, forced sacrifices. Whitaker watched from the stands, his grin returning as Jamal's position weakened. This was it. The boy would finally crumble. But then, something shifted. Jamal leaned forward, eyes burning with focus. He began to see it. The cracks, the patterns, the hidden threads of opportunity. He sacrificed boldly, countered fiercely, moved with a confidence that grew with each passing second. The crowd gasped as the tide turned. Commentators shouted into their mics, and then, after 70 grueling moves, Jamal slid his queen across the board. Checkmate. The arena exploded. Reporters surged forward, spectators cheered. Commentators called it one of the greatest junior games they had ever seen. Jamal had done it. He was the new champion. And in the stands, Thomas Whitaker sat frozen, his face pale, his empire of control crumbling in front of him. For the first time in his life, he was truly powerless. The roar of the crowd still echoed in Jamal's ears long after the final piece was set down. Flashbulbs popped, microphones crowded toward him, voices overlapping with questions. "How does it feel to be the new national champion? Jamal, what's next for you? Do you realize you just made history?" He didn't answer right away. He just sat there, staring at the board. To him, it wasn't about the cameras or the title. It was about the journey, the battles fought, the nights in the park, the old chess hustlers who taught him tricks, the sacrifices his mother had made. When he finally looked up, his voice was calm. It feels like just the beginning, but for Thomas Whitaker, it was the end. He left the arena without a word, slipping into the shadows while the world celebrated Jamal. Back in New York, whispers turned into headlines. Billionaire loses. Bet on prodigy. Whitaker's obsession with chess backfires. Outplayed, outclassed, outdone. Business partners began to distance themselves. Investors pulled out. The image Whitaker had built of brilliance, control, dominance was cracking. His humiliation had become public property, and the cruelest irony, it all started with a joke. Meanwhile, Jamal's life was transforming. He and Gloria were flown to interviews, invited to galas, celebrated as the new American dream. Colleges lined up with scholarships, sponsors offered deals, documentaries pitched ideas. But Jamal stayed grounded. He still visited the Harlem Chess Club, still played with the old men who taught him, still reminded himself that every move on the board was a reflection of life, patience, sacrifice, strategy, vision, and every time he sat down, he remembered Whitaker's words. "Don't forget who you are." He never did. Months later, fate brought them face to face again. It was a charity gala downtown, filled with the city's elite. Jamal had been invited as a guest of honor, his rise celebrated as a story of resilience and brilliance. And Whitaker? He was there too, but not as the host this time. He was a shadow of himself, thinner, quieter, whispers of scandal trailing behind him. Their eyes met across the room. Whitaker approached, his steps slow, his face unreadable. For a long moment, he just stood there, staring at the boy who had unraveled his world. "You destroyed me," Whitaker said finally, his voice low. Jamal shook his head. "No, you destroyed yourself." The words cut deeper than any victory on the board. Whitaker turned and walked away, his empire in ruins, his pride shattered. And Jamal? He stood taller than ever. Years later, people would tell the story again and again, how a millionaire in his arrogance invited a Maid'S son to play chess as a joke and ended up making the biggest mistake of his life. Because what he saw as a joke was actually destiny, and that boy, quiet, humble, relentless, would go on to become not just a champion, but a symbol. A reminder that genius can come from anywhere, that you should never underestimate the quiet ones, and that, sometimes, The game you think you control is the one that ends up controlling you.